Okay, we are good to go.
All right. Welcome, everyone. This is our first meeting of the Commission on Forensic Science for 2021. Still getting used to saying 2021. Can't believe it's here. The first thing I want to do is just thank the staff. I think the state updated their version of WebEx, and they've been frantically working all week to try and make sure that the technology worked the way it was supposed to. So just a big thank you to the staff for all the work you've done this week to help us hold this virtual meeting. We appreciate it. The next thing I want to do is we have two new members of the commission today who've been appointed to serve as members of the commission. The first is Jessica Goldthwait. Jessica actually sat through our last commission meeting for David Loftus. Jessica's with the Legal Aid Society. So Jessica, welcome. And I'll give you a minute to introduce yourself if you want. Just say hello, and if there's anything you want to share with the commission members.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so my name's Jessica Goldthwait, and I'm a staff attorney at the DNA unit at the Legal Aid Society, where I've been at Legal Aid for about 15 years, started off in the Brooklyn trial office, and I'm now in the DNA unit. But thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and with all of you. So I look forward to serving, and I obviously have big shoes to fill with David leaving. But thank you.
Thank you and welcome. And that's a perfect lead into the next thing I wanted to do, and that is thank David Loftus. Jessica is taking David's spot. David, I apologize. I don't have the exact time frame you've been with us, but it feels like you've been with us for about 2 years now, if I'm not mistaken. And you know, I know personally, I really appreciate the perspective that you've brought to the commission. And the knowledge that you've brought to the commission. You obviously have developed a really solid knowledge base over the years with regard to the issues that the commission wrestles with. You know, and you bring a defense perspective that's very much needed on the commission. You know, and you've never hesitated to you know, bring things to the attention of the commission that we really need to be aware of to advocate for positions. But you've always done it in an incredibly professional manner, and I think that's so important both for the commission itself and for the lab directors and lab personnel around the state. They work very hard. They are trying to juggle all kinds of balls, and the last thing they need is to be embarrassed, or treated poorly by the commission. And you really, I think have set a standard for all of us in terms of the professionalism that you've exhibited. So, a big thank you. We appreciate the time and energy that you put in, and we'll miss you. And if you want to say anything, by all means, the floor is yours. I think you're muted still, David.
I said that was super flattering, and I sent you a separate note. And I thought you're extraordinarily welcoming, and your leadership on this commission has been wonderful. I think you let everybody present their different point of views, and the discussions, while they were lively, I think they were always directed in the right direction. And I think that's a testament to your leadership and also the preparedness of the commission. Like the amount of work that folks put in, like working through the binders, I really, truly appreciated working with each of you guys, exchanging ideas. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Jill, Jacqueline, and Shelley. Now I know why you look so good. They are really terrific and sort of like helping us stumble through, the virtual stuff, and even when we had it, in person meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you. And you guys got a huge upgrade. Like Jess is going to be fantastic. She's terrific at the work. She's very dedicated, and you guys are really, really, truly lucky to have her. And a big pitch for her being on the commission, Mike, was your approach to how you run the whole ship. So thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Now, thank you for the kind words. And you are absolutely right about the staff making me look good. They do a fantastic and we certainly look forward to working with Jessica. Our next new member is Michael Marciano. Michael, if I understand correctly, is at Syracuse University now. Previously, believe worked with Kathy Corrado at the Onondaga County Lab in the DNA area. And so, Michael, welcome. And again, if you want to say anything by way of introduction, you're certainly welcome to.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I look forward to working with you all. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. And Michael is replacing Scott Mcnamara. Scott served with us, I believe, since 2014. Scott filled the role of the representative appointed by the New York State Senate. And filled that role for almost 7 years, I believe. And Scott, again, very much like what I said to David, I think you certainly brought a perspective, but at the same time, the prosecution hat that you wear, but at the same time, you were always concerned with, trying to help make sure that we understood the issues, that we were doing the right thing. You were incredibly professional in the way you presented yourself and, handled things before the commission, it certainly made my job a lot easier. So again, just a huge thank you. I appreciate you, and the knowledge and the expertise you brought to the commission, the way you prepared, and the way you handled yourself during the course of our deliberation. So, thank you for all of the time and the effort that you've put in.
Thanks, Mike. It's truly been an honor and a privilege to serve on the commission for the past 7 years. The one thing I can say, New York State's very lucky to have this commission. We're very lucky to have the professional men and women who run these labs, and I learned a lot from this commission. And I also would like to thank Jackie, Shelley, and Jill for all the hard work they do, because the reality is they do a lot of work and they don't get much credit for it as the commissioners do. So I thank them. Thanks again. It was truly an honor to be on the commission and to serve in such an important spot for the state.
Great. Thank you, Scott. And we are having plaques prepared for Scott and David. Given our virtual meetings, we won't be able to present them in person, but we will have them delivered to you as a small token of our appreciation for all the time and effort you've put into our work here. So again, just a big thank you. Next, if I'm not mistaken, I believe, do I have to go through and call the roll just to document that we have a quorum or no? All right, I see someone shaking their head yes, so we'll do that next. So Dr. Buffalino, if you can just answer here if you're here.
Here.
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Here.
Dr. Marciano?
Here.
Dr. Walsh?
Here.
Mr. Castro?
Here.
Ms. Goldthwait?
Here.
Dr. O'Neill?
Here.
Dr. Willie?
Here.
Dr. Dooley?
Here.
Judge Mazzarelli? I think you've got to unmute there.
Here.
Thank you. And Mr. Oster?
Here.
And then I might as well call my own name, Mike Green, and answer here for myself as well. So we have it official. All right, so we do have a quorum. Next item we have is approval of the draft agenda that was provided, that was sent with the meeting materials. Is there any discussion or any questions with regard to the agenda? And if not, do I have a motion to accept the agenda?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Again, we have to do all the votes by roll call, so please bear with me. Dr. Buffalino,
In favor.
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Dr. Marciano,
Yes.
Dr. Walsh,
Yes.
Ms. DeCastro,
Yes.
Ms. Goldthwait,
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Willie,
Yes.
Dr. Dooley,
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli,
Yes.
and Mr. Osterer.
Yes.
Thank you, and I also vote yes. Natasha will remind me if I forget that.
About to.
All right, next on the agenda, we have the minutes from the December 11th, 2020 meeting. Are there any questions or comments with regard to those minutes, copies of which were provided with the materials? If not, do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the December 11th, 2020 meeting?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Again, we'll vote by roll call. Dr. Buffalino,
Yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Dr. Marciano.
Going to abstain because I wasn't there.
All right, thank you. Dr. Walsh,
Yes.
Ms. DeCastro,
Yes.
Ms. Goldthwait,
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Willie,
Yes.
Dr. Dooley,
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli,
Yes.
and Mr. Oster.
Yes.
And I also vote yes, so that carries. Next on the agenda, we have our accreditations and laboratory updates. Prior to getting into the labs themselves, since we have a number of toxicology labs that are on today, and there appeared, at least to me, to be issues. Many of these are on for mid-cycle inspections today, and their accreditation ends June 30th of 2021, which is about 3 months away. I thought it would be helpful to hear from ABFT, with regard to what they're doing right now, what their plans are for mid-cycle inspections, for full inspections, and what they envision in terms of the process to make sure that labs that want to stay accredited remain accredited. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, do we have Dr. Graham Jones with us?
Yes, I'm here.
All right, so maybe, I know I've thrown a lot out there, but if you could maybe just start out and give the commission an overview from your perspective of where you see ABFT, with regard to this process with the New York State laboratories.
Well, just by way of background, American Board of Forensic Toxicology runs on a 2-year cycle. The main year is an on-site inspection in normal times, and the second year has always been a remote off-site review of proficiency tests primarily. Obviously, because of COVID, we've not been doing on-site inspections for the last 12 months, I think it is. And I think everyone has been looking forward and hoping that things will improve dramatically, at least in 21. That seems a little more uncertain than perhaps it was. And so we are continuing off-site inspections, remote inspections during 21. There are 4 laboratories that are due, 4 New York laboratories that normally would be due for an on-site inspection: Nassau County, New York City, Onondaga, and Westchester. And in view of the fact that it's unlikely we're going to be on-site for at least between now and July 1st, we've worked with those 4 laboratories and others to try and devise a means by which we can improve or expand the data that we look at. We're fortunate in the sense that New York labs have already had to have a number of data, especially criminal cases, DUI, homicides, and so on. Those have had to be available remotely as electronic documents. And so we're trying to leverage into that to improve the accessibility of ABFT inspection teams for that data. We've also arranged to because of the increased ability of those laboratories to work remotely, to look at additional data that we ordinarily would not look at for say a mid-cycle inspection, but would ordinarily do for an on-site inspection. And aside from review of case reports, that includes laboratory SOPs, analytical data for drugs, QC data for selected drugs, other quality assurance data, analytical methodology or validation summaries rather, and also training summaries for relatively recent hires. So we have assigned inspection teams, I think, for at least 3, if not all 4 of those laboratories, and we'll be working to develop that remote ability during the next month or so. The timetable is primarily to look at that data during the month of April, and that would allow a few weeks after that, if there are additional data that we need to look at, or if there's corrective action that the laboratories need to undertake. It's a much more difficult process for both the inspection teams, and it's going to be a much more difficult process for the laboratories, primarily in making that data available that's not ordinarily provided, but would be looked at on-site by inspection teams. And for the inspection teams, it's also going to be a much more difficult process. Although the IT abilities of some of the laboratories certainly is very good, it's still a more difficult process. Instead of being able to get into a laboratory for 2 days and have that data readily at hand, having the ability or the difficulty of having access to that data just online is going to be a challenge. The amount of data involved is a tremendous volume for toxicology. I don't know how that compares to other forensic disciplines, but to give you an example, for some procedures, a batch data pack for a single drug group, for example, and can be as much as 400 or so pages, and that's a lot more difficult to review online. So it is going to be a challenge for both the inspection teams and the laboratories, but we're determined to do what we can to provide a realistic reinspection for the laboratories and hopefully lead to a satisfactory reaccreditation by July 1st. That's all I have to say at the moment, but I'll certainly be happy to entertain questions.
So with regard to the 4 labs that you mentioned that are up for accreditation, June 31st of this year, whose accreditation, as I understand it, expires June 31st. If I'm reading the materials right, are they in the process of both the mid-cycle right now and also have the final accreditation due in 3 months? Is that basically where those labs are at?
Well, the mid-cycle would have been completed 12 months ago. So that's part of the process of moving forward into the current 12 months period. So the mid-cycle is completed, but that said, the part of this inspection process, ordinarily on-site, now online, would also include a review of proficiency test materials. That's the primary focus of the mid-cycle for these 4 labs 12 months ago. But this current inspection would include the last 12 months of proficiency tests as well. And conclusion of that process, if it goes satisfactorily, we would hope would result in full reaccreditation of those 4 laboratories prior to June 30. And I think with your timetable, we would hope probably early May, early June at the latest.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Never know how long to wait here, but I'll take it from the silence that there are no other questions. So if that's the case, thank you. We appreciate you taking the time to be here and share this information with us. It was helpful, certainly helpful for me.
No problem. I'm going to sign off if that's okay. I think Shelley knows how to get a hold of me if questions arise later.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, the next item we have on the agenda is Erie County Toxicology Lab. There's a letter from ABFT. It was somewhat confusing to me in terms of whether it applied to the mid-cycle requirements or, the accreditation. From what Dr. Jones just said, it sounds like, ultimately this letter is going to be used as the final accreditation for the accreditation due on the 31st of June. Any questions? It's for informational purposes. There's no vote required. But are there any questions regarding this item?
Mike, just a quick thing. Isn't this, like you said, isn't this, they're going through their mid-cycle now? This is not, they're not at the end of their 2-year. So I'm looking at the subject line and this is a mid-cycle report.
All right, I'm sorry. I'm confusing them with the other four. Yep, you're right.
Right.
All right. So again, this is informational purposes. Any questions on this? All right, next we have Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner, Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. And again, I think this is in the same situation. This is for a mid-cycle report. This is on for informational purposes only. There's no vote required. Anyone have questions? All right, next we have the Nassau County Division of Forensic Services. This one is on for accreditation on June 31st, or their current accreditation will run out then. Again, there is a letter with regard to continued accreditation with attached documentation. And again, this is for informational purposes. There's no vote required at this time. Any questions? All right. Next, we have New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology. Again, we have a letter from ABFT with regard to the 2021 reinspection, similar to the prior lab. Any questions? This is, again, for informational purposes, no vote required. I think the hope is that we'll have the materials and have everything for vote at the next meeting. Any questions? All right, next we have the New York City Police Department.
Chairman, I'm sorry. It's Natasha. I'm sorry. I I got off for a quick second. Did you miss Nassau County Medical Examiner's Office? I don't know if I heard that one.
I did. Thank you.
No, there was Nassau Tox that needed to be done.
It's
I did,
Tox.
Division of Forensic Services, I think, but I skipped the Nassau County Medical Examiner.
The Tox lab.
Yes, yeah, so I'm sorry, so I skipped item E, which is the Nassau County Medical Examiner's Office of Forensic Toxicology. And again, for informational purposes, no vote required. There's a 2021 reinspection. And again, this is another one, if I'm reading it correctly, that's due, the accreditation runs out June 31st. So I assume by our next meeting, we'll have something. And any questions on that item? All right, and then, so that takes us to F, the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Toxicology. And again, the same situation with ABFT, up for reinspection this year. This is on for informational purposes. Any questions? And next we have the New York City Police Department Police Laboratory, continuation of accreditation. Again, there's a letter from December 28th regarding the continuation. As I read it, there was virtual surveillance activity in November of last year. There were no findings. I do believe that we had a report that was provided to us with our December meeting materials, and it indicates that the lab remains in compliance. Any questions with regard to this lab? All right. Next, we have H, the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. There's a letter of March 3rd of this year with regard to continuation of accreditation. There's also a letter of February 11th with regard to continuation of accreditation. As I read them, ANAB conducted surveillance activity in January of 2020. I think one of the things that came up on our review is we noticed the absence of 2020 ANAB surveillance documentation. It's my understanding our staff reached out to the state police, and as a result of that inquiry, we were provided with documentation that previously had not been sent to us after we requested it. I also, as I read them, ANAB conducted a scope extension assessment in January of 2021, and there were no findings. Jill, if you could, either Jill or Shelley or somebody, can you just provide the commission with a little more information with regard to the documentation issue?
Sure. So it appeared that there was a QAS audit that was performed in March of 2020. And when the staff were doing the annual lab summaries, which is taking a look at all of the assessment activities for all the laboratories and everything that's been reported on, noted that it was due and we hadn't received any documentation. So we reached out to the state police and realized there was an error and that they did not forward it to us. And then the documentation was provided. So you will see that the event was last year, pretty, substantially far from last year, but the documentation was provided for this meeting. So we don't want anyone to get confused with the dates.
Do we have someone from the state police lab with us?
We should have Ray or Dave.
Ray's here.
Okay.
Hi, Ray. It's Mike Green. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Dave is also here in the office with me.
Great. Hi, Dave. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Can you just, either one of you, whoever would rather handle it, just, very briefly, give us an indication of what happened here and if there's anything that's put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Yeah, I think what this goes to is a little bit of a changeover in staff and a lack of communication entirely on our part, and a misunderstanding that the QES documentation wasn't automatically being sent to DCGS. So as soon as we recognized that, really we just communicated it with the new individuals and made sure that it was all provided. So again, that's entirely on us. Our apologies in terms of not making sure that communication was clear to our new staff in bio and QA, just to make sure that that documentation is provided in the future going forward.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Anyone have any questions?
Well, Commissioner, it appears the letter is dated March of 2020 and speaks about the assessment of January 2021 in the future. So I think this was just the old letter that perhaps the lab did not forward to us, because it shows, page 28 shows as received on December of 24th of 2020. So I think this is an old letter, not a current letter.
So I'll say there was some older documentation, and certainly as soon as we recognized it, then we were sending all the current documentation. So there may be a bit of a moving target where when we started to realize it and sent it forward, there was also some newer documentation. So certainly there was a time lag where we had documentation where we had not forwarded it.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the Niagara County Sheriff's Office Forensic Laboratory. There's an email chain from February 19th regarding a change of scope request. There's a surveillance visit report as I read it, and then also an email chain from February 24th of this year regarding submission and acceptance of corrective action plan and attached documentation. As I read the materials, ANAB conducted surveillance activity in February of this year. There was one finding that I saw regarding the internal audit from 2020, not including direct observation. The lab did propose a corrective action plan that ANAB accepted. And then as I read it, the lab also submitted a change of scope to remove the materials trace discipline, I think based on the retirement of the only analyst in the lab that was in that discipline. This is for informational purposes. There's no vote required. Are there any questions with regard to this lab? All right. Next, we have the Onondaga County Center for Forensic Science Forensic Toxicology Lab. Again, for informational purposes, no vote required. And there is a letter dated February 1st of this year in the materials regarding ABFT reinspection for this year. Any questions with regard to this item? Next, we have the Suffolk County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. There's a letter in the materials dated February 1st of this year from ABFT with regard to mid-cycle requirements. Again, this is for informational purposes. There's no vote required at this time. Any questions? All right, next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Sciences. This is an item that requires a vote. As I read the materials, there's a letter dated February 17th of this year with regard to a binding recommendation for New York State accreditation. There's a letter dated January 12th of this year with regard to reaccreditation. There's also an email chain dated December 17th of last year with regard to acceptance of all objective evidence and completion of assessment activity. As I read the materials, on October of last year, ANAB conducted a virtual assessment. It was originally scheduled as an on-site in April, but had been postponed due to COVID. There were two non-conformances, as I read them, that the lab has addressed. The commission did look at this at our December 2020 meeting. ANAB also reviewed it, and based on that has renewed the lab's accreditation as I read it. The DNA subcommittee has reviewed this and has issued a binding recommendation to renew the New York State accreditation in the discipline of biology. We have Lydia with us. So any questions with regard to this laboratory or any of these items? And Lydia, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I'm sure I wasn't the most articulate in going through the materials.
You're too modest, Mike. No, I don't have anything to add. We also were asked about it at the subcommittee meeting, even though it wasn't a DNA related issue, or the two issues. But if anyone has any questions about how we resolved it, I do have my QA manager available. But we did take a lot of time to make sure that we addressed what needed to be addressed. So I'll defer to the rest of the commission. If any commissioners have any questions, we certainly are prepared to answer.
All right, if there's no questions, then I would ask for a motion to accept the binding recommendation of the subcommittee and to renew the New York State accreditation of the Westchester County Department of Laboratories and Research Division of Forensic Sciences concurrent with its ANAB accreditation through February 28th, 2025.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. And again, we'll do the vote by roll call. Dr. Buffalino,
In favor?
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Dr. Marciano,
Yes.
Dr. Walsh,
Yes.
Ms. DeCastro,
Abstain.
Ms. Goldthwait,
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Willie,
Yes.
Dr. Dooley,
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli,
Yeah.
and Mr. Oster.
Yes.
Thank you. Next, we have the Westchester County
Chairman,
Division. Oh,
your
yeah,
vote as well. I'm sorry.
I keep forgetting that. I vote yes. Thank you. Next, we have the Westchester County Division of Forensic Toxicology. There's a letter in the materials of February 1st of this year with regard to ABFT reinspection. This is informational purposes. No vote is required. Any questions? All right. That completes our accreditation and laboratory updates. If all of those ABFT inspections get done, I sense that we'll have a longer agenda on that section at our next meeting. So next we have old business. The first item under old business is a familial search update. Jill, do you want to give us an update there, please?
Absolutely. So for the familial search program, we have received 40 applications in total with 6 resubmissions and 2 renewals. That means that we have 32 unique applications. Out of those, 25 have been approved and 12 rejected, primarily due to not meeting the sample requirements. 2 have been withdrawn and 1 is pending approval. Of the 25 that have been approved, we still have 7 in queue or in process. 1 is completed with the training pending. We'll be reaching out to schedule that. And 17 have been completed with the results given and training has been completed.
Thank you. Any questions with regard to the familial search update?
Hey, Mike, a quick question. The ones that are rejected, do the police agencies or the local DA's office, do they reach out to DCJS for help? Or do they just, okay, back to the drawing board or?
No, we let them know why the application is rejected. And if it's a sample issue, obviously we encourage them to work with their local labs to see if there is any additional evidence that could be probative and submitted for the application. You know, we try to do as much as we can prior to the actual rejection, getting supplemental information and things like that, so that it's not just dead in the water. But again, as you know, improvements are made in the process, any ones that were rejected and then may fall into the category of being approved now due to the increase in the validation, then we would encourage them to reapply and resubmit.
Good. Thanks, Jill.
Yep.
I think the Monroe County case where the lead resulted in an arrest on an old homicide case, if I'm not mistaken, is an example of that, is it not? Wasn't the first sample in that a sample that, if I remember right, wasn't a complete sample, and so it didn't meet the criteria? You know, staff let the police department know when they worked with the lab, and ultimately, if I remember right, there was a sufficient sample developed, and that was able to be used.
Correct.
Oh, go ahead.
Is it it's just a question. Does DCGS put any of this, well, obviously after the investigation is over, is there any public site to go on and see how well this program is doing on DCGS? Or is that just, obviously you don't want to give up investigations?
We have not, to the best of my knowledge, like posted anything on a website, but these meetings are obviously public meetings. So
That's
everything,
a good point too.
yeah, everything we report here, you know, A, is being reported to the public, and B, I believe the meeting, recordings of the meeting are available publicly, and I think are the minutes also publicly available once they're approved?
Yes, yeah. So you are forever on YouTube, Pat. So don't worry, all these updates are there. But also if anyone ever has any questions, they feel free to reach out to our office. And we will provide the same information that we've provided at the meetings.
Just be nice. It's obviously successful. It's just nice to show the labor of your work.
All right, anything else on that?
Oh, I had a question. Maybe I missed it when you went through the stats, but are the 40 applications and then the breakdowns, is that from the beginning of the program, or is there a different time frame you're referring to?
Nope, that's from the start of the familial search program.
And is there a separate breakdown for arrests? I think someone, or maybe that was said, has there been one arrest since the start of the program? Okay.
There's been one arrest.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Those 40 applications, if I understood you right, Jill, it's actually 32 cases, but in some instances, applications had to be resubmitted in the same case.
Correct. Yeah, there were some resubmissions again if it was rejected, and then they were able to resubmit, and also renewals. So if the familial search result is such that a potential candidate name is not released to them, they have 6 months from that date of training to reapply and do another search. So we've received 2 renewals on that.
All right, any other questions on familial search? All right, the next item under old business, item B, is the Starmex software issue. There is a letter dated February 17th from the an update, DNA subcommittee update. As I understand it, this matter was discussed at the DNA subcommittee meeting. Dr. Buckleton and a representative from the laboratories that use it were available at the February subcommittee meeting. However, Dr. Weir, the chair of the subcommittee, was not able to attend that meeting. As I understand it, the subcommittee indicated that they were comfortable with the laboratories continuing to use the software at this point, but they put this over till their May meeting so that they could have a full discussion with Dr. Weir present. I don't know, Jill, I think you were at the meeting.
Yep, that's correct.
You want to add to that? Or?
The subcommittee also requested additional information for some presentations to be done. So, and also they really did want Dr. Weir present, so just tabled the matter, but were specific to say that the laboratories were okay still continuing to use it.
All right, and is the anticipation that the subcommittee will formally communicate something to us after their May meeting, assuming they're able to wrap it up at that meeting?
Yes.
All right. All right, any questions with regard to this item? All right, thank you. Next, we have an update with regard to familial search regulations. I don't know, Jill, do you want to update us, or is there someone else? I don't know, Natasha, who'd be appropriate here?
I can start. Natasha can fill in if there's any gaps. So the familial search regulation was approved by the subcommittee and the commission in 2020. It was then published to the New York State Register on January 20th of 2021. And there is a 60-day public comment period. So I believe that puts public comments open until about March 22nd. And then once those are concluded, it continues on its way. And this is where Natasha picks up.
So far, we've only received one comment, if you wish to call it that. It was basically a 2-sentence email. The person just said it's about time, essentially, that we have done, regulated this area. But so far, as of right now, that is the only response we have received.
All right, and if I'm remembering right, was the main change having to do with allowing applications with regard to unidentified remains?
Correct. Yep. Inclusion of the unidentified human remains samples, which we had received some outreach and application that we had to reject due to that. So.
All right. All right, thank you. And probably a good idea to put this on for our next meeting because the 60-day comment period will be closed by then. Any questions on this item? All right, next we have an update with regard to investigative genetic genealogy. Dr. Walsh, you want to give us an update, please?
You know, I'll do a little bit more of an intro, I guess, for the sake of the newer members. The Department of Health, under public health law, is responsible for regulating non-government labs that do forensic DNA testing. So use of DNA for the purposes of identification by a commercial lab and typically falls under our oversight. And with regard to forensic genetic genealogy, there are two combinations of labs that are currently approved. So the Department of Health approach typically for any laboratory would be to review their process from the beginning to the end. So from case acceptance or specimen acceptance out through the final report that's been reviewed. In this case, there were two separate labs that would be involved, and we are calling the bioinformatics lab a lab. And so essentially what happens in the two cases that we have, so the first case is Parabon, is a bioinformatics lab with a current DOH permit in forensic identity limited to genetic genealogy and phenotype analysis for specific things. They have a case acceptance policy, so they accept cases from forensic investigators, and there are parameters that they follow in terms of the severity of the crime and the status of the evidentiary material that's available. Extracts have to be generated by a lab that's approved in New York State, so either by one of our forensic identity labs that the DOH approves, or by one of the forensic labs that the commission has oversight over. And they send that extract to the wet lab, which in this case is Qisagen. They perform the SNP analysis on a particular chip and can do some internal QC and QA, and then report that back to Parabon. They do the bioinformatic analysis and some genealogy work and report that back to the investigators. And then our second approved pair is Bodhi Technologies, and their wet lab is Gene by Gene. And again, it goes through this process where essentially the forensics lab is responsible for making sure that it's processed according to approved protocols, which are backed by validation studies. Again, Gene by Gene can only accept DNA extracts. The reason that we put that requirement on the wet labs is that the initial SNP analysis labs that were coming to us did not have staff that would qualify under our regulations as forensic staff. They didn't have the proper education or training, and that was going to be a major hurdle, which the labs were not willing to necessarily hire new staff and train them for the amount of work that they would be getting. So that's why we said as long as they're working with a work product, the DNA extract, where in any case where the extract is limiting, there's prior agreement with the investigators that they accept the risks of using that, consuming that material for the potential gain that will be attained. These labs, neither wet lab would stand on its own as a SNP testing laboratory for forensics. That is because the majority of the validation that we reviewed on casework like samples actually came from the forensics lab, so from Paragon or from Bodie. So now we have these two entities, combined entities that are approved to do the analysis. And now we are getting a different request coming in from Manny Katranakis at NYPD. And my understanding is that larger two things. One is confidentiality of the investigation, being that certain details of the investigation get divulged to these commercial labs. And the second being the cost of the work being done. And he argues that the NYPD investigators should be allowed to accept raw SNP data from one of the wet labs and analyze that themselves using public databases that are available, such as GEDmatch. DOH typically would be uncomfortable with this, given our policy of beginning to end oversight of this kind of DNA analysis. So then the discussion evolved to say, would this, so he also mentioned that, his intention was to use investigators that would be trained in genetic genealogy to some extent, and he would follow the rules similar to what the commission has set forth for familial searching. He would only do it on serious cases, et cetera. And he largely argues that the bioinformatics portion of the investigation is not forensic science, it's not laboratory based, and therefore he doesn't feel we should regulate it. So the Department of Health obviously wouldn't regulate the NYPD. And so the question became, does the commission or would the DNA subcommittee feel that the bioinformatics portion of this investigation constitutes forensic science and therefore should come under the purview of the DNA subcommittee and the commission? So given that, we thought we would bring it up today and start a discussion about it. And I would just remind anyone who's listening who has a really serious case that they're concerned about, the Department of Health has stated, that we do not regulate any federal agencies looking to have forensic genetic genealogy done. And so if you are dealing with a case where there is any continuing danger to the public, or it's a particularly serious case, that is an avenue that is available to you, is to involve one of the federal agencies, and we are not able to dictate where they go to for their SNP analysis and how they analyze the SNP data that is generated. So I'll leave that there and open it up for discussion.
How is the validation? Is the validation studies, are they available to the public?
No, they're not. Department of Health doesn't freely give out that sort of information, and we're dealing with businesses here, and so we try to protect them. Obviously, any investigator that was interested in using one of these labs could ask for validation summaries directly from the forensic laboratories. That would be my suggestion.
So are the validation summaries available to the commission?
I would ask that the commission goes directly to the forensic labs to ask for that if they're interested in it.
So is each stage subject to a validation study, or it was just Parabon or the the operating lab?
So we reviewed SOPs and validation data for the whole process. Some of it came from the forensics lab, some of it came from the SNP generating lab. But when all put together, we saw enough documentation and data to make us comfortable approving this as a method to generate investigative leads.
Now, Anne, just a question and a clarification point. The process was approved with the two of them working together and not independently, correct? So the wet labs who do the SNP profiling don't necessarily have that DOH approval on their own.
No, they don't, because if we had only looked at what the wet lab had submitted, it wouldn't have been sufficient. So an example would be that the wet lab doesn't have a case acceptance policy that is based on validation data, which indicates, for a particular sample type, what the limit of detection is and what the minimum amount of DNA is that they need to proceed, because that is all handled by either Parabon or Bodhi based on the validation data that they generated. And the wet lab also doesn't communicate with the investigators. That is done through Parabon or Bodhi.
So are they capable of doing, say, a distillation of a mixed sample where they, like major contributor, as opposed to where there's some conclusion before the process starts that this is a distilled sample from
right. So typically, certainly if there's STR data available, they do look at that. Bodhi at this time has limited itself to single source or sexual assault fractions, and Parabon can do some mixtures. And you would have to talk to them about the particular mixture and how close the ratios were, whether or not they can analyze that particular sample.
But we'd have no way of knowing if they were as, let's say, discriminatory as, say, the New York State Police Lab is in dealing with mixed samples in terms of reaching a conclusion as a major donor.
The New York State Police doesn't have this SNP technology at this time.
I know, but we have standards and validation for our labs on them separating a mixed sample. Do we know what the criteria is for distilling a mixed sample before it goes to the wet lab?
We're on your state-approved lab, a forensics lab, and so that's not a new thing. So Parabon doesn't do extraction, so they would work with a forensics lab, probably one of the government labs. Bodhi is a long-standing forensic identity lab, and they do extractions. They do extractions on things like bone, so very challenging samples. So they have a long history of being able to do this. And I anticipate that in some point in the future, they probably will put forth validation.
Thank you.
Hi, and can I ask a quick question? It's Pat. I missed, who's the wet lab for Parabon? I know gene by gene is with Bodhi.
Akesogen?
Akesogen?
Akesogen, yep.
Thanks.
Yep.
Dr. Walsh, I think you had indicated that DOH looked at all parts of the process sort of from beginning to report when reviewing both Parabon and Bodhi, coupled with the wet labs that were working with each of the companies. So when you say report, do you mean after the, I guess, genealogical investigator uploads the SNP profile into a GEDmatch or family tree, gets results, and then starts this sort of comparing centimorgans, or I'm not exactly sure how it works, but that process and building the family trees up and back down, Was that also reviewed by DOH, or did you stop at an earlier point?
No, we reviewed the whole thing.
Mhm.
And they had both lab groups have a track record of doing this in other states. So we were able to look at that data as well.
Are there any set of standards by which you could, I guess, compare that genealogical portion to when the DOH reviewed it? Was there any set of sort of accepted standards governing that?
Standards that speak to this. There's guidance
I'm
out
sorry,
there.
you broke up a little. I'm sorry, you broke up a little. It's probably my internet connection, but I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any standards that are out there. There are guidelines. There are papers, obviously discussing this from a couple of different aspects, but so we went more based on a track record, keeping in mind that this is for investigative leads and that any results that are reported back would be confirmed using traditional methods directly with the suspect, and that would be what would go to court.
And when you describe the NYPD's, I guess, request of you, I'm sorry, just so I understand, the NYPD is seeking to get the results from a wet lab and then actually have its own investigators do the genealogical search. Did I understand that correct?
Correct. So their point of view is that this isn't science, it's to hear.
I'm sorry, you froze again. Is anyone else having that? You froze again. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah,
okay, sorry.
Buffering.
I said, I think that it would be interesting to hear the DNA subcommittee's view on whether or not the bioinformatics end would be considered a science and requires a higher level of sophistication and should come under the oversight of the DNA subcommittee and the commission. I think they're in a better position to weigh in on that.
And maybe if I can just weigh in with a couple of comments. First, with regard to Ben and your request, as to whether or not the commission could get certain documents from the review the Department of Health did, I think it's important that we keep in mind that our jurisdiction is statutory under 995 and is limited. And these are with the Department of Health, as I read it at least, because they're out of the jurisdiction of the commission. So I would question, I understand from a intellectual, point of view why we might like to see those things. From a jurisdiction point of view, I would really question whether or not we have any basis or jurisdiction to be asking for those as a commission. The second point I just wanted to comment on is, the NYPD's request of the Department of Health does concern me. I think there is a reading of 995, which would indicate that that is work that's covered under 995 and that the commission has jurisdiction. And again, I'm not a scientist, and I look at this, through a different lens. But if a police department said, we wanted a lab to develop a profile for us, but don't worry about doing the calculations, the statistical calculations, we'll do those on our own and take care of that piece of it. I would be hard pressed to say how the commission would say, oh, that's okay. Those two aren't interrelated to the point where they're all part of the science. And, again, I haven't listened to the NYPD's arguments, but, my first reaction to it is that of concern. I struggle to see how you can take that piece of the process, separate it out and say, well, that's not science. So it is concerning to me. I don't know if the NYPD is listening. but if that's the path they intend to go down, my feeling is it has to come before the commission. So the commission can at least understand what it is the NYPD wants to do and make a determination, quite possibly with the help of the subcommittee, as to whether or not this falls under our jurisdiction. And I would expect that that would be done before anyone, launched into the process of doing genetic genealogy work on their own without approval from the health department or the DNA subcommittee. Just my feelings at this point. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts they want to add.
And I just want to make one clarification. I wasn't suggesting that the commission come to the Department of Health for reports. I was suggesting that anyone who's interested in the validations go directly to Bodie or Parabon and see what they're willing to provide. Thanks.
No, I think that makes sense. Thanks. Bill,
yeah, Mike, I agree with you that we need to address this to see whether or not we have jurisdiction over it. I just want to ask a basic question right now. The police agency reaches out to Parabon or Bodie. What information do they get back from those companies, and if you know?
They get a report back. So in Parabon's case, they do some phenotypic analysis. They would report that back. And then they would report back a list of potential leads ranked according to both the genetic information from the SNP panel and also from the genealogy's investigation, which would take into account, age, geographic location, related to the time and the place of the crime, et cetera.
So when you say they give you a list of leads, did they give you a specific individual, or did they give you a family tree?
They try and generate a family tree. I don't know if that's something that they're able to do in all cases. But yes, they try to do that.
And do they also do, and I've seen this done in other jurisdictions, do they attempt to generate a drawing of what the individual may look like?
Parabon does do that. They have a gentleman that works on their staff who has, I think, 20 years of experience as a forensic artist. He works with the investigators and incorporates the approved phenotypic features to generate a mugshot, if you will. And we reviewed the phenotypic features and the validation for that. We do not have oversight over forensic artists, and so we did not assess that part of the report. I think it's for the investigators to decide what weight they want to give that.
Okay. Does anybody know, Ann or anybody else know, if any agency has already employed this technique and reached out to Bodie or Parabon and started an investigation?
I don't have any knowledge of that specifically.
Okay.
For full investigative genetic genealogy, I'm not aware of. No, I'm not sure if some of them have done like the phenotypical aspects of it, but for what DOH has just approved them for, I don't know.
I do know that a few of the investigators that I had talked to over the past couple of years, when I contacted them to say that there were approved labs, they indicated that they had involved the federal government and the investigation was underway, and so they took that route to solve their cases.
Hey, and I have a question. This is Mike Marciano. You mentioned that Parabon does mixture analysis. I would assume this is on the SNPs, right?
Correct.
So it seems that they might be a challenge to remove from the equation if you don't have a SNP mixture analysis validated protocol on the operating labs side. Because if the wet lab just provides the SNP data, the actual mixture analysis would be done by the company, I would assume. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm sure Parabon, if they were represented here, would argue that their bioinformatic power is well worth the price that they're charging, and that they, provide a great deal to the science of this.
Right, but if it was used by a state agency, then it would require a validated protocol for SNP mixture deconvolution. Is that right? If there was a mixture?
Well, if there was a case where there was a wet lab that was approved to do this sort of testing, they would have to show us validation with some entity that shows that they could produce SNP data on mixtures and have it properly interpreted. And I don't see how that would happen. So I think in that case, investigators would be limited to samples that are single source, essentially.
Okay, thank you.
And if I can I just want to clarify one thing. You're not asserting that the Department of Health has jurisdiction over, for example, NYPD to stop them from using this as an investigative lead. Is that correct?
No, what we will do is make it clear to the wet labs that they are not approved at this time as a standalone SNP lab for forensic identity investigations, and that if they want to do that in the future, it would require further submission of documents on case acceptance policy. It would require them to do more QA/QC on their end, and they would have to describe, what they report to the investigators and what that report would look like, and any disclaimers or limitations that were on that report, et cetera. So, as I said before, based on what we've seen right now, we could not approve them as a standalone lab to work with an entity such as NYPD.
Okay, but you have done that analysis with Parabon and Bodie and found them acceptable.
Right, because of the data submitted by Parabon and Bodie using their respective wet lab.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to discuss this at length at our next meeting as to whether or not the Forensic Science Commission has jurisdiction over this matter, whether agencies are attempting to use this as an investigative technique and not go through the Forensic Science Commission, not casting any aspersions on them. Ultimately, it would be determined by a court, I imagine. But I just have some concerns because the same privacy issues that relate to familial searching obviously relate to this technology as well.
Yeah, I share your concerns. I think the only question for me would be, do we discuss it prior to anybody coming to us and say we intend to do it? But yeah, we'll put it on at the next meeting for discussion. And I'm recalling that in a prior instance, and I can't think of the context right now, but we did write to all of the law enforcement agencies and indicate that if they did intend to, I think it had to do with rapid DNA.
Rapid, right.
Exactly.
You reached out and said, if you intend to use this, be advised. So, I agree. I think it is worth a discussion at the next meeting, and, we can discuss, whether or not we should be, what role we think the commission has under 995. And Natasha, maybe if you could for that meeting, just prepare, a short presentation for the commission in terms of 995 and any legal precedent or arguments as to whether or not we would have jurisdiction. And then, we can talk about whether or not this warrants any proactive action for the commission.
Will do.
Thank you.
Commissioner, I would also ask that if Anne could keep us up to date if any of the wet labs independently come to DOH and ask for just the SNPs approval So that way, if someone does decide to go that avenue and they do have the opportunity to get the SNPs panel, that then it becomes maybe more of an issue. They have the access to that data, whereas currently they don't.
So we generally don't divulge if someone's applied. We're happy to let you know if anyone gets approved.
All right, if it's good with you, we'll keep this item on for an update from DOH at the next meeting as well. And if there's anything you can update us on, we'd appreciate it.
Commissioner?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to cut you off. And can you give us at least the parameters that a lab would need to meet in order to receive approval from DOH, just in general, or is it on your website?
A SNP lab?
Yes.
It's not on our website. I mean, we have forensic identity standards that should be reviewed, and where they would apply, we expect them to meet those standards. But essentially, at the beginning, meaning they need, based on validation that they submitted and had approved, they need to be very clear on what they can and can't do in terms of whether they can do various different sample types, what their limit of detection is, can they do mixtures, how do they process their SNPs, what is the minimum call rate that they require, what other QC is done on the data prior to it being reported back to the investigators. Are any of the attempted SNPs not reported? So they just need to be very clear on what they're capable of doing, what their quality assurance processes are, and how and what specifically they report back.
Thank you. And Mike, thank you for asking for a presentation for the legal ramifications, because that was exactly what I was hoping for to assist us in having this discussion. So I appreciate that.
No, thank you. Ann, can I ask just a clarification so we're all on the same page? When you refer to a wet lab, my understanding is that, like with Parabon and Bodie, they don't actually do the work to identify the SNP panel in terms of taking, the extraction or whatever it might be, and, doing whatever analysis, is needed to actually develop that SNP panel. Is that work, the lab that work is done in, what you're referring to as a wet lab?
So in this specific instance, I'm referring to the lab that receives DNA extracts from a case and, yes, generates the SNP data based on a specific approved SNP assay, and then reports that data back to Parabon or Bodie.
All right, and then Parabon or Bodie, among other things, would do the work in terms of looking at the genetic tree and making any genetic conclusions as to, inclusions or exclusions.
Right, they do what I would consider the interpretation of the raw data using some public databases as part of that, and then their own genealogy investigation on top of that.
All right, and then I think this also then gets into what Mike was raising, is part of that interpretation could involve mixture interpretation as well at the Parabon level as opposed to at the quote unquote wet lab level.
Yes.
All right. Which again, I think is something significant in terms of our analysis. If some police department example says, we just want you to send us the results of the raw data and we'll take it from there. Are they going to do the mixture analysis as well? Are they, so I just think there's a lot of things that we need to be looking at here. So I think this has all been helpful to me, at least. Scott, I think you were trying to get in here.
Yes, I'm not, I don't run a DNA laboratory, so my knowledge is really not as wide and breadth as others on the panel. So I just ask if we get a 5-minute presentation on what were all these different steps that Mike that you were talking about, because I have been making assumptions that the DOH was certifying the wet laboratory in regards to the DNA analysis, and then they would provide that information to the investigators to then search in a public database. But I actually, like I said, I'm not very well versed in this. I am a member of the NYPD, but this is not in my lane. So I just think it's important to differentiate the steps, because as we keep saying, Bodie and Parabon aren't doing any laboratory work, as I would see it, but they are taking a wet lab who are producing data, and I would assume they're using public available websites. Whether they get a single source submitted from an agency, therefore there would be no mixtures to be concerned about. But I'm getting confused, to be honest, and exactly what role each person plays.
No, I think that's fine. We can look into some type of presentation to make this clear. The one thing I would say is, I hear what you're saying. I would not agree that they're not doing any laboratory work. I think we're using this term wet lab, and I think maybe that's the distinction. But, to me personally, at least, if you're doing mixture, deconvolution and, other genetic conclusions from it, from my lawyer perspective, to me, that's every bit as much lab work as, the person who develops a profile. It's just a different kind of lab work. But I hear what you're saying, and we'll try and see if we can't put together a brief presentation. Maybe Ann, you could help work with our staff and see if we can't put something together briefly that just lays this out so everyone's on the same page in terms of what we mean when we talk about this. And we'll do that for the next meeting. Any other comments or questions on this? Pat?
Sorry, it's one last question for Ann, and I think I may have asked you this in a past meeting. What is the least amount of template that can be used for their assay? Do you know offhand?
I don't want to say offhand because it's been a little while since I reviewed the validation data. I do recall that in some cases it depends on where on the specimen type. So, for example, was it a extract from blood versus bone, etc. So I would go to Parabon and Bodie to ask them that.
Thank you.
Probably didn't think that your brief update was going to generate all that conversation, did you?
Oh, I had a feeling it would, actually.
All right. Well, thank you.
It's one of those things where we finally thought we had everybody approved and all the investigators would be happy, and then I got that phone call, so it starts again.
You keeping us up to date, so thank you. So that takes us to new business, I believe. And the first item under new business is the 2020 Annual Lab Summaries. Jill, do you want to just briefly comment on this? Or Shelley, or whoever's appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. So the annual lab summaries review all accreditation pertinent documentation that's been submitted by the laboratories and tracked at OFS and reviewed by the appropriate body. And so what we do is each year we take and compile those documents and put them in a spreadsheet for you. We have the labs certify that that is indeed all the correspondence that's happened throughout that year, and they review and sign the attestation. We have then provided it to the commission.
All right, thank you. Any questions? All right, the next item we have.
Commissioner, if I could just interrupt for one moment.
Sure.
So I need to go back to laboratory accreditation items for just a quick moment and have Shelley read an email that we received from Graham after he had signed off the meeting. And it has to do with the status of the laboratories who accreditation will be expiring. And there was, it was kind of a pronged approach that we should have taken with the mid-cycle and the full cycle. So he provided some more additional information. I just want to make sure that the commission members are aware of what the ABFT is looking to do for the tox labs that are going to expire.
Okay.
Okay, hold on, I just gotta flip screens here. Okay. Good morning. I know, let's see. This is addressed to the 3 labs who had mid-cycle and extensions last year because of the pandemic. So Erie, Monroe, and Suffolk. I know at least one of you was on a commission meeting just now, and likely all of you. Commissioner Green asked about the New York State labs whose accreditations will be expiring June 30 this year. That had previously had extensions as a result of the enhanced reaccreditation package review. It would appear that we overlooked the fact accreditation of your labs was only extended 12 months from July 1, 2020, and that some action will need to be taken prior to June of this year. The action was based on the hope that we might be able to arrange on-site inspections in 2021, which now seems unlikely due to the ongoing pandemic. At this point, my inclination at this point is to simply extend the accreditation of the labs for a further 12 months, subject to the satisfactory performance of the mid-cycle reviews. That would bring the accreditations back on cycle, which has implications to the expiration of the ABFT accreditations in 2022, for allowing for further reaccreditation in 2022 and some extra time for the transition to A and AB to occur. We could try to perform a more detailed virtual reinspection process later this year, similar as is planned for Nassau, New York City, Onondaga, and Westchester, but that could be tough to arrange as ABFT already has 20 virtual reaccreditations scheduled. They'll work with ABFT board and ANAB to arrange satisfactory solution. Graham.
So I think it's important to note that they're looking, as long as the mid-cycle is satisfactory, that they'll extend it for that 12 months in order to get back on cycle for the ones that were due.
So just help me understand here, these 3 that we're talking about, what they previously got a 1-year extension, if I'm understanding that correctly. Was that an extension on the mid-cycle?
Correct. Right.
So they had actually 2 extensions in 2020. If you recall, they were extended until September of 2020, and then, no, excuse me, December of 2020, and then June of 2021. And they had a paper review, and then an expanded paper review. And then this mid-cycle that would have occurred in 2021, this is their scheduled mid-cycle, but they didn't have a full activity last year.
So their mid-cycle is basically overdue because of the extensions. It's been extended a number of times. Is that, they should have had their mid-cycle a year ago, basically, and we've extended.
They should have had a full reaccreditation last year, a full inspection, and they didn't receive a full inspection.
All right, those 3 should have had a full inspection, and there should have been a vote on whether or not they're reaccredited, and instead we extended their accreditation. All right, and now he's talking about extending them again. Just, I don't know, maybe I'm not grasping this, but it kind of seems backwards that the ones that were up this year anyhow, they're making provisions to do, and the ones that are, late or overdue, and I get that we granted them extension, we're going to put off again. I don't know if that, just to me, that doesn't seem right. It seems like if we have ones that should have been done last year, they should get priority this year, that we shouldn't put them off again. I don't know if anyone else feels that way or if I'm missing something here.
I'd say in general, I'm getting confused about which laboratories need what action. So maybe we need something aside from a quick email, like a really thorough detailed description of what's going on with each of these laboratories so that we know what to do. Because I know I don't want to vote on anything right now because I don't understand what's going on. It's gotten a little bit muddled.
We
So
want to get
if I,
Graham back on the phone too. We can also do that as well. When he stepped off the call, he did say that he would be available if we reached back out to him, so we can definitely do that as well.
Well, it's before we get him on the phone. Am I understanding it right? Because like Lydia, I'm also confused here. Am I understanding right that there's 4 laboratories whose full inspection is due and their accreditation expires June 31st, so that, absent an extension, they need a full inspection, whether it's virtual or in person, and action by the commission to have their accreditation renewed by the end of this year? Are there 4 not by the end of this year, by June 31st? Are there 4 labs that are in that position? Or am I wrong about that?
Yes, there are 4 of our tox labs who their accreditation cycle was 2019 to 2021. And those 4 labs are fully expiring. We have 3 labs whose accreditation was 2018 through 2020. And those 3 labs did not have a full inspection in 2020. They were given those multiple extensions. So yes, we have 4 labs, and ABFT seems to have a process in place for the 4 labs who need a full inspection. And that will involve the virtual witnessing and the document review. But the 3 labs from last year didn't go through any virtual witnessing. I believe that they had a virtual document review of some sort, which is what allowed for the extension, and ABFT anticipated going to those 3 labs this year, but is now saying they can't.
Which I get, but it seems to me to focus on the 4 labs that are up this year and say we're going to take the 3 labs that were up last year and didn't get done and just put those over another year. I'm struggling with that. I don't know how other people feel. And if other people feel the same way, I guess I don't want to get Graham back on unless we have some kind of consensus about what we want to ask him to do. Is anyone else uncomfortable with this proposed course of action by ABFT, or is it just me?
It's hard to understand why it's been so long that they haven't had a remote program up. I mean, A&AB does it pretty well at this point. I know it was pretty thorough, so I didn't feel like we lost anything out of it, but my assumption is by July 1st, they're remote. Is that correct? The accreditations are up June, but I believe he said something about being remote capable July.
no, I think, and we can ask Dr. Graham, but I think we're saying is that the 4 laboratories that are supposed to get a physical assessment, not mid-cycle this year, there is an enhanced virtual assessment, which I think is appropriate. But the other 3 laboratories, I think we should consider, should they get an enhanced virtual assessment this year in their mid-cycle, because they have not had any enhanced assessment for the past couple of years. And if we vote again, we're going to wait another year based upon the amount of workload. So I think there, or even if there's a intermediate, I don't know if there's another intermediate for them, but I think to have another surveillance visit, I don't think it's not surveillance visit, to have another mid-cycle, that would be three levels, or 2.5 years ago. Sorry, I'm getting confused now. I'm going to stop talking.
No,
I'm getting confused.
I get your point. And Pat, to your point, either the last meeting or the meeting before, we specifically brought ABFT in to ask him this point and to say that we felt that they were behind the curve here, that ANAB seemed to have adapted and developed a good virtual program, and that we were concerned that ABFT had not. They assured us that they would get on it. At least that's my recollection. So it doesn't seem that they've gotten on it and developed a program to the point where at least I'm satisfied. And it sounds like Scott has some discomfort as well.
I mean, it's still early in the year. Well, not that early in the half year, but I mean, there still is a chance that they can have a virtual program and push these labs through. But is it one is a full assessment and the remainder are surveillance? Is that what the issue is? Because it's kind of bifurcated a bit. Not everyone's at the same level.
Is
Well,
there any,
Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
is there any possibility that they could have some in-person inspections too? I mean, they're talking about returning to normalcy in many ways in June and July. We're planning on going back to in-person sessions starting in April in the courthouse.
Yeah,
Behind the curtain.
I'm not so focused on whether they do it in person or they do it virtually, but to me at least, ANAB has found a way to do virtual, full accreditation visits. And it may not be quite the same as when they went there in person, but it seems to be thorough enough, that they can get a sense and we can get a sense of whether a lab should be accredited or not. And ABFT hasn't. So I guess, in an ideal world, they would go do a physical inspection. But for me, whether it's physical or virtual, I just think that they shouldn't be putting these 3 labs off again. They put them off last year, and now I don't want to see them put them off again. So yeah, I'm not comfortable with that. That, again, just me personally.
I know it's a bit of an issue because they already have the 20 virtual reaccreditations that they have. But to me, extend the ones that need the mid-cycle. And, if the mid-cycle is looking at the proficiency test, which is what he stated, then you should consider extending the mid-cycles and getting those full accreditations done instead.
All right. Are people in agreement that we should try and get Graham back on the phone and try and get some clarity from him?
He's on and listening, and he's available to talk.
All right. Thank you. Graham, can you hear? It's Mike Green.
Yeah, I can. Thank you. I heard a little bit of the last 2 or 3 minutes of the discussion, and I actually had one of the people from New York, one of the labs, remind me about what's happening with the labs that had their mid-cycle extended this past year. And I agree that we need to work forward to do something, ideally to have the 3 labs that had their accreditations extended from 2020 to 21 to try and get them brought into the virtual inspections that we're planning for the other 4 New York labs that we discussed earlier. And so we're going to try and look at that. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge just because we have a total of 20 labs that we have to go through some kind of a reaccreditation process in this calendar year. But we will definitely look at trying incorporating those 3 labs in New York State whose accreditations were extended to June of this year, the so-called mid-cycle labs.
Yeah, I know I'm just speaking for me personally at this point, but for those 3 labs, as I understand it, they were due for, inspection and accreditation last year, and it was extended. And I'm very uncomfortable granting further extensions without, some type of rigorous process, whether it's virtual or in person, that gives the commission assurance that the labs are still meeting the standards and operating, at the level that we expect them to operate at. And, while I don't like granting any extensions, I would be more comfortable granting brief or reasonable extensions to the labs that are up this year than I would granting them to labs that have already been extended. And so then they would be going on, 3 or 3.5 years without any oversight of the type that would give us comfort that they should be reaccredited. And I don't say that to in any way speak negatively of the labs, but our function is to provide an oversight function, and to only, have labs have our stamp of accreditation, if we have some assurance that they continue to operate to the standards that they should be. And, as we get further and further down the line with these extensions, I get less and less comfortable granting them, and I'm, at least for me, it's to a point of real concern with those 3 labs, not based on anything specific about the way they're operating, but just based on the fact that we haven't had the, oversight, and look, and God forbid something goes wrong at one of those labs, I can see the IG's report now, that will accuse us all of being asleep at the switch and just granting extensions. And that's not a position any of us want to be in.
No, I understand what you're saying. I mean, certainly the mid-cycles reviews that have a very important component in the lab accreditation program, and those were performed last year, and there was more interaction between the inspection teams and the labs beyond the mid-cycle, although it was somewhat limited, I would agree. But we will look at trying to get those labs in some kind of a further review process, a virtual review process. I'm not sure if it's going to happen prior to July, but we will try if we can. One of the issues that we're obviously still facing with is COVID, and although one of the speakers indicated some areas are opening up, the courts in some areas are opening up in July or June or July, oh sorry, April. We have at least 1 and possibly 2 ABFT inspectors that say they're fully vaccinated and their employers will allow them to travel. So that is a possibility that could occur prior to July 1st. So we're juggling a number of issues. Other inspection teams or inspectors that we rely on are also, full-time employees in charge of their own lab. And some of those employees have basically said, you cannot travel before, say, July 1st. So there are still a number of employees, especially state employers, placing restrictions on travels of their employees. So we have to try and balance that against the feasibility of doing a virtual inspection, a good virtual inspection prior to July 1st. So I think ABFT has an executive call going to be scheduled within the next week, and so we'll try and figure out the best way forward with this. But I hear your concerns and I understand.
Other questions or comments from commission members?
Well, Mike, I think, can we ask if at least by our next meeting, we know when those inspections or the form of inspections are scheduled? So at least if we're going to act on an extension, we know what the horizon is for the lab being reviewed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a reasonable request. And I would add to that, even before the meeting, Graham, if you could, in writing, as soon as you have a plan in place, send us correspondence in terms of what the plan is and, what you intend to do.
Yeah, I can do that. Just for reference, when is the next commission meeting?
The next
June 4th.
commission means June 4th.
Okay, thank you. And I'll get something to you prior to June 4th.
Thank you. Scott?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when we voted for the extension, how long did we vote the extension for? I don't recall. So is there a deadline?
The extension was 12 months. So that would be 12 months from July 1st of 2020.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That was their extension. Shelley, what was our extension also corresponded to that, or was ours only 6 months?
Well, we voted there has been 2 separate extensions last year. So there was an extension that got us to December 31st. And then at the December meeting, we extended it to June 30th.
So we only did 6-month extensions, Scott.
Okay, thank
ABFT
you.
did a 1-year extension.
In any event, both accreditations lapse the end of June, if I'm hearing this correctly.
That's my understanding, yes.
Other questions or comments from commission members? All right, again, thank you, Graham. We appreciate you getting back on the phone, and I know this is difficult, and I appreciate you, hearing and understanding how it looks from our perspective.
I do. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Yeah, you too.
All right, back to new business, and I believe we're on letter B, which is the familial search expansion validation. We do have a letter dated February 17th in the materials. It's a binding recommendation, as I read it, to accept the validation. Do we have Ray or someone from the state police that could just give us a brief overview? Do we have someone with us here?
You should be unmuted, Ray.
Oh, thanks. We have Irfan Mukhtar and Dan Myers who conducted the actual validation. They'll be able to help out with any technical questions. Are both of you on the line?
And maybe, at least for me, what would be helpful is just a very high level in terms of what changes, were made that the validation applies to.
Sure. The biggest things that, I guess there's a lot of background noise. Perhaps that's me. If you can hear me okay, great. So the biggest change is where we are moving to 20 loci. And also there's right now an inability to deal with females or those with incomplete YSTR profiles. So the ability to look at what we're doing and then provide a different threshold for the likelihood ratio or statistical determination where we're able to deal with those profiles that did not meet the full profile criteria, particularly as they relate to YSTRs. And in your earlier discussion, you referred to a case that didn't meet that threshold. So what we wanted to do was use our experience and then do further validation just to enhance those criteria. So that's the overview.
Great, thank you. Any questions or comments from commission members?
I had a question. I understand Dr. Weir sent the binding recommendation, but I watched, I think it was the November DNA subcommittee meeting, and Dr. Weir had expressed, I think, some concern about the independence of loci and the effect that would have on generating statistics. And I don't think he said necessarily it would affect the candidate list produced by the New York State Police's method, if I understood what was going on well enough. And I understand that at the next DNA subcommittee, Dr. Weir and I think Dr. Sozer had gone to the state police to discuss this issue. But I just am curious what happened. Presumably Dr. Weir's concerns about the formula and seeing the formula that New York State Police uses and generating these thresholds was alleviated. I just wondered if the concerns he had raised about the independence of loci and the generation of these statistics is that still a concern, or?
So I don't personally feel it is, and what he's referring to is corrected for in a theta factor, and that is that we make the assumption that there's true full dissociation of alleles, and in fact that's not fully true. The way DNA disassociates, so you can multiply these frequencies together, you tend to see a little bit of a homozygote versus heterozygote imbalance, and that is typically is corrected when we give out statistics with what is known as a theta factor. Now, we didn't apply that within the statistics that we were doing, but frankly, there's so much built in terms of conservatism, and then these are investigative leads, and then we're building that into the threshold. We didn't feel that adding that additional statistic was really pertinent to what we were doing, really a big sort, and then determining a threshold by which we could show these are family members or not. So we felt in our validation that all of that was in essence corrected for, and it is a minor corrective factor. So in the discussions our folks had with Dr. Weir and Dr. Sozier, we believe that that was handled and then was further discussed by the DNA subcommittee meeting at their last meeting.
Just one follow-up question. Say you did apply I'm not totally clear on how these thresholds are generated, but if you did apply the theta correction, would that move potential candidates, you know, outside the range of, or outside the threshold? Like, would it have an effect on who's within the threshold and who's outside? If that makes any sense?
Now, I don't feel it would. However, I think maybe because I've got the folks who actually did that validation. Irfan and Dan, are you available to discuss that more specific question? Okay, not hearing them, I guess I'll address it.
No,
Now,
so hang on, Ray. They might just be *3. They should raise their hand and unmute, and then Jackie would unmute them.
Okay.
Irfan is unmuted. I don't see Dan or a hand raised for him.
Go ahead. Irfan.
He's unmuted, right? So he should be able to talk.
Yep, he's unmuted. And I also just unmuted caller user 6, which might be Dan.
Okay, Dan just joined me in the office. So, go ahead, Dan.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
You just go there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, so the question was about whether or not people would move up and down the list based on whether or not there was a theta factor provided with the statistic?
I think that's my question, yes.
Yeah. I don't know which direction they would move, but definitely when you adjust the numbers, people do move up and down. But what we found in our validation was for the large majority of candidates that we would find true relative associations, they're usually grouped well above the threshold. Those edge cases, there would be very few of them that would affect. And in addition, Dr. Weir's concern about using theta to correct for the allele dependencies. What we did tell him is that in casework laboratories and the local laboratories, at least our laboratory, that theta correction factor would be applied when they went to do the direct matching between the unknown and the known sample, so that eventually it would get applied, just not in the familial search.
And Dr. Weir and Dr. Sozier were satisfied after the meeting. I mean, apparently if they sent the binding recommendation, but that's your understanding?
Yes, they were.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? If not, then do I have a motion to accept the binding recommendation of the DNA subcommittee to accept the validation thresholds as proposed by the New York State Police?
Thanks, Dan.
Motion made.
I second.
Thank you. We'll do the vote by roll call again. Dr. Buffalino,
Yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Dr. Marciano,
Yes.
Dr. Walsh,
Yes.
Ms. DeCastro,
Yes.
Ms. Goldthwait,
Abstain.
Dr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Willie,
Yes.
Dr. Dooley,
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli,
Yes.
Mr. Osterer,
Yes.
and Mike Green, yes. I remembered, Natasha. All right. Next on the agenda, item C is mitochondrial DNA. And this is foreign to me, massively parallel sequencing validation. But we do have a letter dated February 17th of 2021 with regard to a binding recommendation to approve the validation. Before we proceed, though, do we have someone from the OCME who can answer questions here?
We should have several folks on the line.
My understanding is that we've received documents, basically updated validation documents earlier this week. And what I would like is someone from the OCME to explain to us what was presented to the DNA subcommittee that they issued the binding recommendation on, and then what these new documents pertain to and how they differ from what was presented to the DNA subcommittee. So if someone from OCME or as many people, whoever is appropriate, could explain that to us, that would be very helpful.
Yes, good morning, Commissioners. My name is Jonathan Q. I am one of the validation leads for this project. Previously, we had submitted our validation documentation, including executive summary pertaining to a brief description of the technology and the experiments that we had performed to address each of the swig dam validation guidelines. The additional documents that we submitted recently were essentially some clerical corrections to elements of the validation write-up. More specifically, there were 3 things that were done. In one instance, there was a sentence that had been included in one of the experimental descriptions that had been from an earlier draft of the validation that pertained to a different structuring of the results as they were presented. So that sentence actually didn't pertain to the write-up that was submitted, and therefore it was removed to remove confusion. Secondly, we added, it was discovered during our early implementation work that in the validation write-up paperwork, the model numbers were switched with the serial numbers for the 2 different models of MySeq equipment that were used in the validation. So we actually had serial number for one machine referring to the opposite MySeq model. So in all instances where that switch had been made, that was corrected. And additionally, in reviewing the data to ensure that the model numbers and serial numbers were corrected, we also found 2 instances in which we had not mentioned that we had also performed additional experiments using using one of 2 additional flow cell kits that were used in those experiments. So those were essentially the additions that we have made to our additional submission. And those changes with regards to specifics as to page numbers and citations are on the final page of the addended executive summary that we submitted.
So, and again, I apologize, it's taken me a minute to wrap my head around this, but so with regard to the different instrumentation, you indicated that, if I heard you right, there was an issue with regard to the documentation of the instrumentation in terms of what was provided to the DNA subcommittee versus the materials that we were provided with this week.
That's essentially correct. So in many of the instances within the document where we referenced a particular serial number, and we stated exactly which of the 2 models that particular experiment was performed on, it was actually switched. And that was determined during the course of our implementation by going through paperwork and realizing that the serial numbers we had actually switched. So the technical conclusions are still the same, wherein our various experiments showed that we showed reproducibility between the 2 models by performing experiments on both of the two different models of MySeq that we had available. It was just a question of the documentation of which model was used for which experiment.
All right, in that is information the DNA subcommittee has not seen yet?
We did, I believe we sent that documentation to the subcommittee as part of this process. Can that be confirmed by the staff on call?
Yeah, I should refine my question and say it's information that they hadn't seen as of the time they voted on the binding recommendation. Is that correct?
That's correct in that, these are essentially administrative corrections to that write-up that they voted on.
All right, and then there was some discussion, I'm not sure I understood it all. In addition to the instrumentation correction, you indicated or discussed something, and again, I'm having trouble figuring out just how to phrase this, but was there additional work done or additional, from the time that this was presented to the DNA?
No, sir. No, sir. So what ended up happening was, in reviewing the data and re-reviewing the write-up, it came to light that the data that we presented to the subcommittee, which was included in the write-up, didn't, in the procedures section, acknowledge the fact that the experiment had been performed not only in the time that was cited within the write-up, but also had been performed on another flow cell type as well. So that data was presented. It was simply that in the methods section, we hadn't explicitly stated that we performed the experiment on more than one flow cell.
Thank you. Anyone else on the commission have questions or comments?
Yeah, I think I'm a little uncomfortable with material being submitted after the DNA subcommittee approval. I think it should go back to them for review.
I share your concern.
Do we not consider just administrative mistakes in regards to, like, we're talking about serial numbers? The data was still provided, and in regards to the flow cell, the data was provided, it just wasn't included in a certain area of the report that is part of that was included. And then maybe I'm not seeing what you're saying, but all I'm hearing is that they caught clerical mistakes and an omission of describing the flow cell, but not an omission of the data. And please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that is in fact the situation, sir.
So Scott, I hear what you're saying, Scott. It is exactly what that is, but I also just want to let folks know that what our office received were actually 12 attachments that had been modified since the submission and the binding recommendation for the subcommittee. And while some of these errors would have may have come to light during their accreditation activities or assessment activities, my concern is we now technically have two versions of what's out there. And while this version, again, only has the clerical corrections, the binding recommendation was based on the previous version.
And I would just add, Scott, I hear what you're saying, and it may well be true. I'm just, I'm hesitant to make that determination for the DNA subcommittee. I should say, I am of the mind right now to say that it's really, I think, for the DNA subcommittee to say, hey, no problem, this is all clerical administrative and we're fine with it, or no, it's not. I just personally feel a little uncomfortable making that determination for them. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
I think I was leaning towards Scott's explanation about what was going on until Jill mentioned that there were 12 documents that were submitted. So that seems to me like a lot for us to, and I agree with Mike as well, where we'd be essentially making a decision for the subcommittee about what they would deem an administrative problem as opposed to a technical issue that maybe they didn't actually review or take into consideration. I understand what the OCME is saying, but at the same time, this isn't our decision. So it's our decision based on another entity's decision. And I think they should have the opportunity to look at what is being said and maybe ask their own questions about what it is being presented as a clerical issue as opposed to, a technical issue.
And I would, if in fact these are technical issues, the DNA subcommittee, I would hope would be able to look at it the next meeting, tell us that they don't feel it changes their mind and send us back another binding recommendation. And then at our next meeting, we can vote on it and approve it, and it will be done. But just, that's my sense. So, if there's no other discussion, I would make a motion that we send this back to the DNA subcommittee so they can review the additional materials submitted, and just let us know whether or not this changes their recommendation.
If I'm sorry, this is Jonathan from OCME. Before the vote, may I add one minor point?
Absolutely.
Just that while we are talking about 12 documents, what we are saying is that the clerical error was from within each of the 12 documents, but it's not that there were 12 additional documents that were submitted. So these are essentially versions where, in many cases, a line or so was corrected to reflect a correct model or serial number within documents that had already been submitted. And of the documents that were submitted, 12 of them required this administrative change.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Do you need a second?
Yes, I've made a motion.
Second.
All right. Any discussion? All right. We'll do the roll call vote again. Dr. Buffalino?
Yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Dr. Marciano?
Yes.
Dr. Walsh? Dr. Walsh? All right. Yes. Ms. DeCastro?
Yes.
Ms. Goldthwait?
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Dr. Willie?
Yes.
Dr. Dooley?
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli?
Yes.
And Mr. Oster?
Yes.
All right, so then we'll go back to the subcommittee and hopefully we'll have it back and can.
Mike, your vote, and that it carries.
Oh, I'm sorry. And Mike Green, yes. All right, so that will go back to the subcommittee and hopefully we'll have it back and can vote on it definitively at our next meeting. Next item is accreditation compliance. Jill, can you update us here?
Yeah, so it's the beginning of a new year. So we like to just kind of put out the friendly reminder to all the labs who are, we're very thankful and you do a great job working with us just to keep contemporaneous with the documentation that you do submit related to the accreditation activities. And that if there, is any question about submitting it, submit it. And, it's OFS's job to, if it's relevant or not in terms of relating to commission matters. So, we appreciate you guys working with us. We understand the crazy times that we live in, especially that some labs are still hybrid in their conduct and working from home. But please utilize us as a resource and continue to submit the documents to us.
Yeah, just for all of the labs listening, the commission, at least from my perspective, has an important role and a significant responsibility, and we appreciate the relationships we have with the labs. We can't do our work without those good relationships. and obviously you can't do your work without our accreditation. So we really rely on and depend on each other. And the, exchange of information that Jill talked about is so important. So, if you have any questions at all, about whether or not things should be provided to us, just reach out to staff and ask. And again, we appreciate everyone's cooperation. So thank you. The next item we have on the agenda, item number 7, our laboratory disclosures. Our first item is the Erie County Central Police Services Forensic Laboratory. There's an email chain dated January 13th of this year. As I understand it, it's both the initial notification and closure of a nonconformance. As I read it, it involved an evidence receiving issue. The analyst noted that evidence was in an unsealed state upon initial examination. The root cause analysis identified that the evidence had been improperly sealed by the submitting agency. The lab has retrained evidence clerks and customer working groups, and the lab considers the event closed. Any questions with regard to this item?
Yes, I have some questions about whether or not this involved a matter in which someone was prosecuted and whether it was disclosed to the parties that the evidence was received in this condition, because these kinds of questions and issues go directly to a chain of custody
Do we
chosen
have
by the court.
Do we have someone from the lab who can speak to this?
Yes, we do. This is Maria Orsino, the quality manager. I also have Michelle Schmitz, lab director, with me.
Hi, Maria. Hi, Michelle. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
So could you hear the judge's questions?
It sounded like she was wondering if any of them had been prosecuted.
She was wondering if the case or cases involved here were cases where someone was prosecuted, and if so, what disclosures were made to the prosecution and or defense with regard to the chain of custody issues, if I understood Judge correctly.
Better put than I did. Thank you.
All right. At this point, none of them have been prosecuted, but the record of nonconforming work is filed in each case file. So that definitely would be available if that comes up.
So if discovery were provided, if there were an arrest, discovery were provided, this would all be documented in the case file that would be provided with discovery?
Correct.
Right.
That's provided to both the defense and the prosecution?
Yes, it is.
There's also a letter to the customer too that is involved, so that they did put a word out to their customers.
Well, the customer, I assume, is the prosecutor authority.
Well, it could be the police department here too, right?
Well, I should have said that better. It would be the arresting authority, or the one who obtained the evidence. But that would be someone who would be in the shoes of the prosecutor. So this would be important for both the prosecution and the defense to have knowledge of.
Yeah, I guess for me personally, from the, just looking at the lab, and did the lab do what they were supposed to do? If they've sent this notice to the police department and they've put it in the discovery file, that if there's an arrest would go to both the defense and the prosecution, my personal feeling would be that the lab has done everything they're required to do. Now hopefully, as possible, either Brady or, just discovery material, both the police and the prosecution would turn this over and the defense would get it when they got the file. But, for me, at least looking at what the lab did, it appears to me the lab did what they were supposed to do. Other comments or questions?
Just a quick question. What was the nature of this evidence? I think I saw that one was ammunition, but was the other a firearm or?
And the other was a firearm.
2 cases, it was ammunition, and a third, it was a firearm.
And were these items being sent to test for operability, or were they being tested for DNA? Were they going to be swabbed for DNA?
Just operability.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mike, I have a question, or maybe a couple of questions.
Now go ahead.
In looking at, and for the commissioners, I'm looking at page 157 of the binder, which has a corrective action report. The first instance was in May of 2020. Then on November 5th of 2020, it was indicated that there was a presentation on evidence seals and safety given to attendees of customer working group. So I'm assuming these are the law enforcement agencies who submit evidence to the laboratory?
Yes, it is.
So that was on November 5th. But then on November 12th, there was a second nonconformance with a seal problem. And then on December 7th, there was another instance. And then December 16th, there was another instance. So what was it about the presentation? I mean, did the customers, it seems to me that even though there had been a presentation to the customers on the 5th of November, there were 3 instances after the fact of the presentation, as opposed to the one that had been a few months prior. So I'm wondering whether maybe they didn't quite understand what it was that was being told to them, and maybe that's not a fair way to put it, but it doesn't seem to me like the presentation to the customers gave you the desired result, which was no more submissions of evidence improperly sealed. So that aside, and that was probably speculative, is there a way that if a submitting agency comes to your laboratory, that the submitting agency can actually correct the seal prior to it actually being turned over to your evidence clerks for acceptance into the department?
Yeah, God. So we have a window. This is Michelle, the director. We do have an intake window that has been closed since the start of the pandemic, and so all of our submitting agencies have been using a lockers for submission that are open 24/7. So we don't have a date to reopen the intake window where that would be an in-person transaction. And that would be handled right there while the officer's there, and so we would see that the tape, you know, isn't secured properly, and the correction could be made before it was even received into the lab. But all of these instances occurred at a time when the window was closed. So we're just receiving what was submitted into a locker.
Right, that explains a lot. And obviously, without having that direct contact with the submitting agency, you don't have a way to rectify the problem prior to it actually getting into the laboratory system. So I don't think that I saw anything in this report that explains, by way of explanation, that during the COVID shutdown, there wasn't that direct interaction by the submitting agency, so it really could not be fixed at the time of submission. And that would have been at least something, I think it would have been helpful to know that that was part of the reason why this happened. Because just to be, you know, I've never seen this issue come up, so it was surprising to me that there was such a frequency. But this, certainly the shutdown due to COVID, explains to me a lot of why this happened.
I appreciate that insight, because I think we sometimes take for granted some of this, and we forget that not you unable to see our process, that's not obvious. So I do appreciate that insight and note taken, so thank you.
Everybody in the country dealt with COVID differently. So it definitely is not a one-size-fits-all situation about how each laboratory system dealt with evidence submission. So that's just, we should never assume, because that one little, piece of information to me changes my whole point of view about what it was that went on with this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That's all I got.
Thank you, Lydia. Other comments or questions? Michelle, Maria, thank you. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, we have the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. There's a letter dated February 12th regarding closure of a nonconformance. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that we'd previously been notified of the nonconformance, and this is a closeout. As I read the materials, it involves missing drug evidence, and the corrective actions included changing procedures, relocating equipment, and additional staff training, that the lab considers this event closed. Any questions with regard to this disclosure? All right. Next, we have the New York City Police Department Police Laboratory. There's an email dated March 3rd of this year, a closure notification and acknowledgement. Again, as I read this, this item is the closure of a nonconformance that involved misreporting of marijuana after the definition of hemp went into effect on March 8th of last year. There was confusion between hemp and marijuana. It was determined that the error was likely due to the timing of the law change and the onset of the pandemic. Corrective action includes reminding analysts of policy changes, and the lab considers this event closed. We obviously have Scott with us. Does anyone have any questions with regard to this item? Next, we have the Suffolk County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. There's an email dated March 9th of this year. As I read it, it's the initial notification to us of a nonconformance. It's an issue with regard to bupa. I can't even pronounce it. Maybe someone can help.
Bupropion.
Bupropion, the quantitation for bupropion.
All right. And as I read this, the lab has started the corrective action. So I assume that this will be on a future agenda when the closeout is reported to us. But at this stage, does anyone have any questions for the lab? All right. And I believe that's all of our disclosures. I think we do have a item or items on the agenda for executive session. So I would ask, do I have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to either a current investigation or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular individual?
This is Scott. I make the motion.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. And again, we have to take a roll call vote. Dr. Buffalino?
I'm in favor.
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Dr. Marciano?
Yes.
Dr. Walsh?
Yes.
Ms. DeCastro?
Yes.
Ms. Goldthwait?
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Dr. Willie?
Yes.
Dr. Dooley?
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli?
Yes.
Mr. Osterer?
Yes.
And Mike Green, yes. All right, so at this point, we're going to go into executive session. If you are not a commission member or staff to the commission, I believe somehow we'll be blocking everyone else out of the meeting. And then once executive session is ended, the meeting will be opened back up again. So maybe what I'd suggest is we just take a very short break. So let's say at the latest, be back in 5 minutes, and we'll start our executive session.
Deputy Sheriff?
Taking a little bit longer than normal. Hang tight. And there's also a call-in user 19 that just got in the attendee list. I'm not sure who that is, so just beware.
Oh, that might be me. It's Meredith from the city.
Oh, okay. Hi, Meredith.
Hi.
Just waiting on YouTube still. Sorry. Oh, okay. So we are good to go.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jackie. Appreciate all your help with the meeting.
Sure.
So we're back in regular session. There were no actions taken in executive session to be reported on. As for regular session, I guess this would come under new business. There are two items I do want to address. So the first, there's been correspondence between the commission and ANAB regarding the OCME in a particular process or testing that was done, or interpretation of that testing might be more accurate. And I would make a motion that we have staff contact OCME and flag specifically the communication with Pam Sale that referenced the conversation with the FBI, and also flag for them the DNA subcommittee's comments with regard to that conversation, and indicate that we would like the OCME to be present and address for the commission at the next meeting that issue, and specifically their position on what happened, whether or not it should be viewed as a non-conformance, and how widespread it was, and what, if any, impact it may have had on cases that were reported out in the past. I would make that motion unless there's anything anyone wants to add to that.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All right, Dr. Buffalino, if you're in favor, indicate yes. Opposed, no.
Yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Yes.
Dr. Marciano?
Yes.
Dr. Walsh?
Yes.
Mr. Castro?
Abstain.
Wait. Jessica?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Yes.
Sorry. Dr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Dr. Willie? Ann?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Dr. Dooley?
Yes.
Mazzarelli?
Yes.
Roster?
Yes.
And Mike Green, yes. All right, so that passes. The second issue is we've had correspondence with ANAB with regard to the way that they resolve differences between assessors, and probably inaccurately stating this, but they've provided us with documentation regarding their protocol. And as I understand it, the commission has questions with regard to the process and the protocol. And we would like, or I would make a motion on behalf of the commission that we have ANAB present at this meeting to answer questions about that part of the process and about the protocol that they provided us. So anyone want to add anything to that, or did I capture it all right? All right, so not hearing anything, do I have a second to that motion? All right, Judge, thank you. So again, take a vote. If you're in favor, yes. Opposed, no. Dr. Buffalino,
Yes.
Mr. Fitzpatrick,
Yes.
Dr. Marciano,
Yes.
Dr. Walsh. Okay, I see yes. Ms. DeCastro,
Abstain.
Ms. Goldthwait,
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Dr. Willie,
Yes.
Dr. Dooley,
Yes.
Judge Mazzarelli,
Yes.
Mr. Osterer,
Yes.
Mr. Green, yes. All right, so that passes. I believe that is everything we have on our agenda, unless anyone else has anything. All right, our next meeting is June 4th. Again, we anticipate that will be a virtual meeting. I want to thank everybody for their time and attention during the meeting and for all the time that you've put in reviewing the materials. You know, we really appreciate the work that all the commission members put in, so thank you. And again, to the staff at DCJS, you know, a huge thank you for all you do to make this happen. So with that, do we have a motion to adjourn? All right, Ben, do we have a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor, raise your hands. All right, that's everybody. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care and stay safe.